But first, I wanted to speak about the appalling decision to drop what should be the key objective of the Closing the Gap agreement, to cut by half the number of Indigenous women and girls who are victims of violence. Instead, the Australian reports that the final version of the agreement, which is expected to be signed off this week, will have more aggressive targets for reducing the number of Indigenous adults in detention. So they removed the specific target of reducing by 50% the proportion of Indigenous women and girls aged 15 and over who experience violence, and replace it with platitudes about significant and substantial reduction, but they insert bolder, specific targets about reducing the number of Indigenous adults and youth in detention. That tells you plenty about the priorities of this agreement. The primary concern isn't for the victims of abuse, but their abusers, who sometimes end up in jail. As Indigenous leaders Jacinta Price and Warren Mundine have repeatedly pointed out, the overwhelming majority of Indigenous people in jail are there for crimes of violence, often against their loved ones. Domestic violence is not just a crisis in Indigenous communities, it is an epidemic that is a national disgrace. Indigenous women are 35 times more likely to be hospitalised due to domestic violence than other Australian females. 35 more times. Think about that for a second. And yet taxpayer-funded Our Watch, which is supposed to combat the scourge of domestic violence, blames colonisation and white settlement for the high rates of abuse suffered by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women and children. Our Watch, along with a number of other taxpayer-funded bodies, believe the key to eradicating violence against women, including in Indigenous communities, is to promote their version of gender equality. And they link everything from risque jokes to gendered toys to the gender wage gap to gender inequality and hence gender violence. Instead of targeting resources to communities where violence against women is endemic and having an honest discussion about the links between poverty, alcohol and domestic violence, Our Watch claims rigid gender roles and stereotyped constructions of masculinity and femininity are drivers of violence against women. If you do want to have an honest discussion about violence in Indigenous communities, then you best grow a backbone, because the social justice mob will be out to get you. The very folk who supposedly care so much about Black lives that they're willing to hold marches during a pandemic are strangely silent about Black-on-Black violence and the lack of support for women and children in the most at-risk communities. Not only are these moral posturing cowards silent, but they attack those who do want to bring national attention to this crisis. Women like Bess and Jacinta Price have been the target of horrid abuse and threats from leftists who want to silence them. It tells you plenty about the level of debate in this country, that you can be labelled a racist if you care about vulnerable women and children in Indigenous communities and want to bring attention and resources to helping a group that is by some distance the most disadvantaged and voiceless in our country. Too many in the media refuse to broach this subject honestly because they are terrified of the backlash. This self-censoring phenomenon is evident in Australia as it is in much of the Western world, where the left has captured much of academia, the bureaucracy, and the bulk of the media, entertainment world, and an increasing number of woke corporations, all of whom determine what is acceptable discourse. A national survey by Cato released earlier this week reveals that the only group that isn't afraid to express itself in the US is the hard left. Majority of every other group, including conservatives, moderates, independents, and even centrist lefties, said they self-censor. The same trend is observable in Australia. Indeed, it's worse here, given we don't have a constitutional right to free speech in this country. If the Closing the Gap agreement doesn't have clearly defined and measurable targets for reducing violence against women and girls, then what's the point of having it? And what is Minister for Indigenous Australians Ken Wyatt doing about it?